The problematic prince. He came. Erna thought as she saw Bjorn enter the room. He actually came. She was starting to think he would not show, and she felt the depression hit her like the wind. But now that he was here, striding across the room to her, she felt hope rekindle inside her. There was something off about the way he walked though, and as the initial shock of seeing Bjorn enter the drawing room, she noticed that the man who normally walked with such grace and purpose stumbled across to her. He did not have to get too close before she could smell the alcohol that surrounded him like an invisible cloud. She looked up into his drowsy eyes and they swiveled as they struggled to focus on her. As you can see, I am in no fit state to have luncheon at this current hour. Bjorn fumbled the words out of his mouth. She was surprised he could form a coherent sentence. Hope burned away in Erna's chest and made room for anger and disappointment. She knew she had to reply to him, but she couldn't find the right words. A part of her wanted to slap his silly, drunken face, but the royal etiquette training advised that a future queen did not behave in such a manner. Bjorn sighed at Erna's silence. "Will you wait for me?" he said. "How does dinner sound?" "What?" Erna said, trying to make sense of his slurring, and noticed he was looking at a clock on the table. "Fine, yes." The whole situation was ridiculous and disrespectful. Erna did not have to put up with this and knew she should say something, but what would the point be? She doubted Bjorn really knew where he was and what he was doing. "Fine, we will have dinner instead," but she doubted he would even remember or be conscious. "Okay then." Bjorn moved in closer to Erna and whispered, "Miss Hardy, I will bring you a gift of apples." Bjorn handed something over to Erna, something he had been holding the entire time that Erna only just noticed. When she saw what it was, she recoiled and brought a hand up to her mouth. The golden deer antler trophy, the very thing that started all this mess in the first place. Lisa had explained to her the importance of the deer antler trophy, or rather, the feigned importance these bachelors put on it. It was awarded to the best drinker at the stag party, which meant the prince had broken his promise to her and had spent the entire night, at least, getting drunk for this stupid thing. Erna felt like she had been struck with a gong and her head spun. She stared at the trophy the prince had put into her hands before wandering off to the sofa to lay down. He looked to be going to sleep. "What the hell is this?" Erna demanded. "A wolf horn," Bjorn said sleepily. Erna felt suffocated. Wolves do not have horns. "Is that so?" Bjorn lazily opened his eyes and looked at Erna. "I suppose not now, it's been cut off." Bjorn whispered a laugh and the drawing room became silent, save for the ticking of the second hand on the clock. It eroded away the silence on top of Bjorn's heavy, drunken breathing. "I should have refused you," Erna thought as she let herself fall to the seat opposite Bjorn. She looked at the man she was to marry next week. All these problems and difficulties that she couldn't understand, all because she was to marry the prince. The wedding was already done, and the participants were fait accompli. Grandmother and Mrs. Grieve were moved to tears and were relieved the wedding was finally done. Bjorn smiled and looked as if it were a simple Sunday afternoon. He looked down at her with drunken eyes. "You are awake, I see." Erna looked at her drunken fiancé as he slept. He looked like a simple man that had fallen asleep, not a hung-over prince who had given her the most bizarre gift. A wolf horn, that was actually a deer horn, which is won by a bachelor in a drinking contest. Bjorn was not a bachelor, and he did not win the drinking game. It was a confusing mess of identity ended in a confusing gift. The first thing Bjorn saw when he opened his eyes was a delicate young woman holding a gold stick like she was the queen with a scepter. Recognition was slow. Memories hurt and pounded his mind for attention, but when he grasped at them, they fled to the back of his head. "Are you okay?" He knew that voice. The soft, angelic song of Erna Hardy. "Should we postpone dinner, like luncheon, or will that be delayed too, until it becomes breakfast?" only for that to be luncheon once again. Erna said. Something was wrong, Bjorn realized. He picked up the thorns laden within Erna's tone. He sat up on the couch, which sent his mind into a panic as it tried to figure out which way was up, or was it down? Would you mind waiting a little longer? Bjorn said through a barren, dry throat. I think I need to do a little preparation before we have dinner.
Fine.
Erna snapped. Bjorn rose and looked down at the little kitten with its tail fluffed and claws out. He smiled pleasantly at Erna and strode out of the room. He tried to walk as straight as possible, but his head was still having trouble reorientating itself to the correct alignment of the world, and he stumbled a little before he reached the door. About an hour later, Bjorn returned to the drawing room, freshly washed, shaved, and dressed. All notions of his drinking had vanished, and he was fully alert. Shall we go? He said. He offered Erna his hand. For a moment, he thought Erna was going to refuse. Her face was coy, and it was clear that she was still upset, but Erna took his hand delicately and allowed herself to be led out to the garden room. It was mainly used for breakfasting, but Bjorn felt the need for some fresh air. Bjorn drew out a chair for Erna and then went to sit opposite. The table was already laid out for the evening meal, of which there was only a placemat and cutlery in front of Erna. Bjorn winked at the servants, and they busied themselves with serving the food. Once the staff had laid out the dinner in front of Erna and a cup of coffee in front of Bjorn, Erna finally spoke. Why do you not eat? Erna asked. This is enough for me, Bjorn said and rubbed his stomach. If you have something to say, will you say it already? Erna said, who felt burdened by the pregnant silence. Well, not really, Bjorn said, playing with the coffee cup. He had not taken a sip of it yet. But you're the one that set this up, Erna said, right before stuffing food in her mouth. Well, yes, I just thought it would be nice to share a meal together, before the wedding. Is that really all? Were you expecting another reason? Bjorn sipped at the coffee, regretting it soon after as his tummy gargled at him.
No.
I don't expect anything from you, she wanted to say, but stopped at no. Bjorn seemed to relax a little more and watched Erna eat her dinner. The hunger in Erna was enough that she ignored his staring. Now and then she would dab at the corners of her mouth with a napkin, take a sip of water, and grab up the fork again to dig in. Erna might look like a bird pecking at a feeder, but she could eat like a horse, but she was always careful to follow proper etiquette as dictated by the book. By the time the desserts arrived, the mood between Bjorn and Erna softened a little, but each time Erna looked up at Bjorn, who hadn't taken her eyes of Erna, she would look back down at her food as if in embarrassment. You wish to say something, Miss Hardy. Would you just say it? Bjorn said in frustration. Erna put down the small fork. She had been harassing an innocent chocolate cake with it for hours. She looked up at Bjorn and met his eyes. I want to bring my maid to the palace, Erna said. Your maid? You mean the one who could be a guardian for the gates of hell? Bjorn said with a cocked smile. Of course. She and whatever servants you wish are welcome. No, Erna didn't rise to Bjorn's jest. Lisa will be enough for me. Bjorn caught a look in Erna's eyes and a twitch in the corners of her mouth. There is something else? The wedding, Erna started. Paused. Our wedding. It's traditional for the bride to be given away by her father. Yes, Bjorn said. I would have liked my grandmother to walk me down the aisle. She is the one who has earned that right. But if I don't follow tradition, it could bring harm down on the Luchen royal family and to you. Erna looked at Bjorn in earnest. So, what you're saying is that you don't want to follow tradition to avoid your father walking you down the Virgin Road. Erna nodded. If memory serves, Viscount Hardy is still alive and well. Bjorn said thoughtfully. I don't want to be lead into my new life by a man who gave up being my father. Erna said. Okay, Bjorn said. He showed interest in what Erna was saying by twisting the corners of his mouth thoughtfully. Erna's pale cheeks flushed red as they looked at one another, and her will could be seen, clear as day, in her defiant eyes. If it's going to cause disrespect, then I will abide by tradition. But if there is another way, Erna held her trembling hands under the table so the prince couldn't see. Then I would like to hold your hand. Would you please take me? Erna's blue eyes reflected the candlelight that lit up the garden room. They seemed to dance with the very fires of courage and determination. Bjorn realized that before him sat a rebel with the face of an angel. It feels so strange, Grandma, Erna said, fidgeting with her hands. Are you scared? A little bit, Erna said, cautiously. From the day she received the marriage proposal, up until now, she had been scared, and the closer the wedding got, the more the feeling dominated. The fact that she was going to marry the prince made Erna feel quite helpless. Why did the prince propose? Erna said softly. Isn't it because he loves you? Contrary to popular opinion, the Grand Duke has an eye for hidden gems. The Baroness smiled. Erna laughed lightly. After Bjorn had proposed in front of the Baroness, her view of the man changed. She seemed to completely forget the past and all the times she criticized the prince, dubbing him the problem child of the royal family. Erna wanted to tell her grandmother that it wasn't true. The prince didn't love her, but she knew her grandmother was lying, just as much as she was. Erna had almost gotten herself embroiled in a scandal, which would have ruined her future. Becoming a Grand Duchess brought joy to the Baroness, but within that was the deep sadness of leaving her granddaughter. My dear Erna, I was so afraid that you would follow in your mother's footsteps. To be with a man that cheats and lies and does not care for his children. Bjorn was horrifyingly like Walter. It made me sick. It would not have been good for you to lose your heart to such a man. I rushed all the way here to save my granddaughter from such a fate, but I boiled my insides for nothing. The prince is not like the rumors. He is a fine young man. The Baroness smiled, even as her eyes turned red with tears. Erna knew of the rumors. During her tumultuous time in the city, she had heard all the evil gossip and learned how such rumors could destroy a person. Baroness Baden knew as well, so came to Erna's side. She knew the rumors about Erna were not true. The Baroness assumed the rumors about the prince could also not be true. She watched Bjorn over the last few months and came to the conclusion that the rumors were grossly exaggerated. She was wary and knew that her view could be distorted by the desire to find happiness for Erna, but she knew the prince could be afforded a level of trust. There is nothing to be afraid of, Erna. You will do well, the Baroness said. Just be yourself. Really? Erna said. Of course. Erna knew her grandmother was not looking at this objectively, but she wanted to leave the mood light. So she smiled and nodded, so that her grandmother would be left with no worry in her heart. You will make your mother proud, okay? Baroness Baden said, giving Erna a kiss on the forehead. Yes, Grandma, Erna said. Erna closed her eyes and snuggled into Baroness Baden. It did not feel like a night that she would be able to sleep, but she closed her eyes and tried anyway. Her grandmother smelled like flower petals and her skin was soft and warm. She could hear the rhythmic thud of the old woman's heart. Erna engraved the moment in her mind. She wanted to remember this always. You shameful bastard. Do you really think you can treat the father of the Grand Duchess like this? Walter Hardy gritted his teeth and looked down at his bandaged leg. He wanted to get rid of the damn thing, but he made a promise. Hold on a little bit, honey. It's just for one day, Brenda Hardy said, holding out a set of crutches. Trembling at his humiliation, Walter accepted the crutches meekly. It had been 2 days ago, in the evening, that Prince Bjorn had come to Walter Hardy at the Hardy mansion. Walter felt pride that he was to be the father of the Grand Duchess, but the words the prince spoke boiled his blood. Miss Hardy will be holding my hand on the walk down the aisle, Bjorn said. It was an order that left Walter bewildered. He tried to argue tradition and formality, the many virtues that the prince should abide by, but he did not even raise an eyebrow. It was like talking to a wall. "What? But Your Highness, what will the people say? There will be outrage. They will not accept this," Walter said. Walter was driven into a corner, and he protested. For his daughter to face such humiliation on such a momentous occasion, it was unbelievable, and the prince acted so casually about it. "Then we will create a reason," Bjorn said. "He must be drunk. What other reason could there be for this madness?" Walter blinked at the prince, as the prince stood there as tall and proud as ever. "We won't say that you are in bad health. I don't think that is a good reason," Bjorn said flatly. He was looking at Walter's leg. "What are you suggesting? You really dare go this far?" Walter said. Maybe it was because Walter was worried that Erna had told the prince everything, but no matter who he was, he had no authority to intervene in a father's discipline of his child. Walter carefully prepared a rebuttal and waited for Bjorn's response. "Yes, so what? She is my wife," Bjorn said. It took Walter off guard, and he felt his fighting spirit bleed away. In the end, he had to acquiesce the prince's suggestion. Walter fumed at the ruse and cursed every living thing under the sun. The prince swanned into his home like a perfect gentleman, insulted him, and then floated out of the house like nothing was out of place. The roads were lined with crowds of people that all clustered together along the paths to the Schuber Palace. Even though they spoke of the end of the world for the Luchen royal family, they cheered for the spectacle of it. "Hey, there they come. They're coming," they called when the luxurious golden carriage trundled past, pulled by 4 white horses. The bride's procession was led by regal-looking royal guard. In their formal attire, they looked splendid and dignified. It was nothing when compared to when Princess of Lars as the crowned princess, but it could never be called inferior, only prepared in haste. "I can't believe he can catch such a woman," some said, as they saw the beautiful princess through the windows of the carriage. "She may be beautiful, but she is no Princess Gladys. She is a whole different class," others said. The clatter of tongues permeated across the procession. The prince's second wife does not look all that much. She's so arrogant, just staring off like that. She is very different to Princess Gladys. At least she showed some kindness. She is very haughty, is she not? With her nose up in the air. By the time the rumors spread through the streets, the carriage passed along the Archdukes Bridge. As the palace drew closer, Erna started to turn ever more pale. From the moment she put on her wedding dress, her mind went blank and she struggled with her nerves. She realized she had been like this from the moment she boarded the train to Schuber. Everything seemed like a dream, and she imagined the real Erna Hardy was still asleep somewhere, probably on that train. That reality seemed a lot more likely than the one she found herself in right now. The one where Erna Hardy becomes a princess. When her carriage stopped outside the royal chapel, Erna let go of the tethers of her delusion. She struggled to suppress her rapid breathing as she got down from the carriage. It was lucky that she was led to where she was needed to be. Her mind was so fuzzy. She struggled to notice where she was, and when she looked down, she was already on the red carpet. Erna stared blankly at the bouquet of flowers that had appeared in her hand. A whisper of a voice in her mind wondered where they had come from. Had she been holding them the entire time? She looked up at the closed door in front of her, and she could feel the fear rise up in her. She was afraid of this door more than any door she had ever faced. It was about to open, and beyond would be Erna's new life. "I can be happy." She remembered the promise she had made confidently. Her heart pounded and felt ready to burst. Her legs were trembling so much they barely kept her upright, and the flowers of the bouquet shook. "I should turn and run." The conviction felt so certain in her head. It was the only true course of action, but as she felt the motion, a shadow fell over Erna. "Erna?" She looked up at the soft voice and saw him, the Prince Bjorn. He was to be her chaperone into the new life. He felt more like a guard escorting her to her execution. "Breathe," Bjorn said. "Breathe," Erna said to herself. "That's it, breathe, relax," Bjorn said. Bjorn seemed jovial at Erna's outward struggle to mentally contain the situation. He held her hand and she could feel it. "Thank you," Erna said, her voice trembling. "You heard my request." Erna gave an awkward smile as she waved a hand. Bjorn laughed lightly as if to confirm what Erna had said. "I will be a good wife," Erna went on. The moment she made that promise, her voice became firm and the trembling stopped. Bjorn still just smiled at her. Even as the door opened, he looked at her and smiled. Even as the sunlight, tainted with reds, greens, and blues of the stained glass window at the far end of the chapel, washed over them, Bjorn smiled at her and led her to her new life. The second royal wedding was underway. It was a lot different from the first royal wedding, which was so noisy and busy that the souls of the prince and princess, who were so used to the tumultuous and public lifestyle, were drowned out. At the end of the Virgin Road, in front of the archbishop who was to marry them, Bjorn slowly turned to Erna. He did not let go of her hand. The light from the stained glass window bathed the pair in rose light. Under the gaze of hundreds of onlookers, Bjorn lifted the veil that covered Erna's face. It was such a small gesture and only the first act in a long line of prescribed ceremony and tradition. It was also a pointless act to uncover the face of the one he had looked upon so many times before today. It was mainly for the masses. The corners of Bjorn's lips gently curled into a smile as he looked into Erna's eyes. The fierce blue was tainted by the red light and looked like flames sparked in the sky. Erna looked like a flower in the wedding dress of layered lace and delicate silks. He wanted to applaud the tailor, who did a splendid job of encapsulating the country girl who liked long dresses. She had remained stiff right up until the moment the archbishop began to speak, and then a change came over her. She took on the air of an eager student. Her eyes shone as she concentrated on the archbishop's long, projected syllables that resonated a little more enthusiasm than his usual bored drawl. He then turned to Bjorn and his face became a visage of damnation and hellfire. Those eyes made his words feel more like threats than promises of devotion, especially when coupled with words like forever, until death, duty, and honor. "Do you hear me, Your Highness? Do you understand my meaning, Your Highness? Under pain of burning in hell for all eternity, Your Highness," the archbishop seemed to say. The Bjorn continued to smile in spite of the archbishop's stinging glare and coolly said, "Yes, I get your meaning." Bjorn thought the archbishop may resent him a little. He smiled more at his wedding to Gladys, and now, for years later, he was marrying another woman. No doubt that disturbed him a little. Bjorn could see that he looked at Erna with pity as he blessed the couple, with a booming voice that was loud enough to be overheard by the bells. Bjorn concluded the ceremony by bowing low and giving Erna a kiss. The crowd did not cheer, but they clapped and the hall of the chapel made it sound like 100 thunderstorms, coupled with the bells. The noise was incredible. When Bjorn pulled away from the kiss, Erna's eyes opened and looked brighter than ever, like a pair of shimmering sapphires. Erna nodded her head lightly, as if contemplating something, and locked Bjorn with a firm gaze. She smiled at him. She no longer shied away. Erna Dniester is so beautiful. Bjorn thought it was a satisfying fact.
No.
Throughout the wedding, she had heard the word repeated over and over again. "No, Your Grace, no, Your Highness, no, Your Excellency." Erna looked at Mrs. Fitz, who stared Erna down with firm, fierce eyes. She had only said that she could take a bath by herself, but was made to feel like a criminal about to be hanged. His Royal Highness is the host of Schuber Palace, which means you are the first princess, the Grand Duchess of Luchen. "We have the responsibility to maintain the appropriate dignity, Your Highness," Mrs. Fitz said. It was difficult for Erna to understand. Would bathing alone be such a detriment to the dignity of the Grand Duchess? Laid in the hot water, the scent of flowers making her mind all fuzzy, she thought back on the day. She had started the day at her grandmother's side as Erna Hardy. She ended the day, naked, in a bath surrounded by maids, as Erna Dniester. It was a disjointed feeling. Luckily for Erna, Lisa was still by her side and poured hot water over Erna's shoulders. "It will be okay, Your Highness," Lisa said. It was still unfamiliar to hear Lisa use that title. Erna lowered her head and touched the petals with her nose. She prayed that the time would pass, to be out of the bath and dressed, in her own room and alone. Big, she thought. Everything is too big. The thought, which must have come to Erna a dozen times, only now seemed appropriate. The palace was far too big and Erna was overwhelmed. When Erna moved to Hardy Mansion from Baden Mansion, she was amazed by the grand scale of luxury, but this blew that well out of the water. In Erna's room alone, there was enough grand luxury that was impossible to measure any value to. In reality, none of it belonged to her. Although Mrs. Fitz had prepared the room for Erna, technically it all belonged to Bjorn. How shameless of the Grand Duchess, to be married to the prince and have only her body to bring to the union. Erna was well aware of how the people viewed her and the slander they spread. The Baden family were unable to keep a single country house, and the Hardy family was so poor they only brought debt to the royal family. Bjorn was willing to bear it all. The mansion of the Baden family was secure and firmly belonged to Erna. The Hardy family was able to escape bankruptcy, and it was all thanks to Bjorn's money. The people added up imaginary sums of money and wondered how much of it could be left. She noticed the flower-decorated table and the 2 drinking glasses placed upon it. She was not so naive that she didn't know what was to be expected on a couple's first night of marriage. She just never truly believed it could happen between her and Bjorn. As she sat, the day unfolded in her memory once more. From the carriage ride up to the chapel, the stern gaze of the archbishop, which quickly turned to pity. After the wedding, they rode together through She didn't realize until she was rudely awakened by nearly falling from her perch. The clock said it was nearly midnight and Bjorn had not yet returned. He must still be celebrating with his friends. So Erna curled up on one side of the bed. Mrs. Fitz's stern admonition came to her head, but she didn't care. She was too tired. Drowsiness and fatigue turned her mind to mush as she considered the ramifications. Her eyes slowly closed as she rationalized her choice. The sweet scent of flowers and the romantic candlelight wrapped Erna in sleep, which was to be her only companion on the night of her wedding.